Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the beauty of our virtual connection. We are all over the world and at all times of the world. I am very honored to facilitate this conversation, this roundtable with three very, very good friends. And before introducing them, allow me to do some housekeeping announcements. First, we are live on YouTube in the GWL Voices channel, so you can use that for further listening once we finish. We have interpretation in Spanish, French, and Arabic. And just so that you note, the Arabic is under the Chinese option. Interpretation is in the globe at the bottom of YouTube. For some reason, we got it in the wrong box, but Arabic is when it says Chinese, so you may be able to listen to that. And again, going into what brings us together today, Afghanistan brings us together, and in particular, the women and girls in Afghanistan. And to discuss about this issue that has caught our attention in the past few weeks and should catch our attention in the coming weeks and months, we have, first of all, Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group, and most importantly, a very, very good friend. We have Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and a member of our GWL Voices. And we have Fatia Serur, Justice Impact Lab co-founder, former Deputy Special Representative and Assistant Secretary General in Somalia in the United Nations mission there, international human rights expert, Africa Group for Justice and Accountability member, and also a member of our GWL Voices. And to start this conversation, I think it will be just appropriate to listen to the DSG, to listen to Amina, and hear what she has to say about where we are, where the UN is, where the larger system is, and bring us to speed. So Amina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and for having us and facilitating this really important discussion. Through the General Assembly week, we had discussions on the situation in Afghanistan. I think it's close to everyone. And we all want to know what can we do about it and how we're leaning forward. Also for the UN, we have stayed and we are continuing to try to collaborate and to deliver on really important gains that we've had over the past 20 years. So I'm really honored to be with Fatia and with, of course, Mary, whose shoulders we stand on as we move forward. Afghan women and girls have much reason to be concerned, and we are with them all the way. And we're not just behind them, we're beside them in this struggle. Almost every day brings some disquieting news, the resurrection of the Ministry of Virtue and Vice, the reopening of high schools to boys only, the ordering of women to temporarily stay at home from work. Clearly, these measures, especially if consolidated in permanent rules and regulations, will crush the hopes for a better future. And so today's discussion and what our common roadmap should be in moving forward, where advocacy plays its part, where the continued programming plays its part, where the conditionality and the engagement of the Taliban on recognition, what does it mean to be recognized? And we must be very careful here because there is a neighborhood. And so Afghanistan's not in isolation of its neighborhood nor the rest of the world. And then I think, here, how can the country become more stable when half of its population can't fully participate in public life, and what are we going to be able to do about it? I think that it's important that we all step back and understand that if the international community does not act as one, does not have unity in some very basic principles, common ground and basic human rights with women and girls right at the front, then I think from the get-go, we are already weak. And that's would be a huge chink, a weak chink in our armor. So we are trying very, very much as the UN to try to do that and engaging with the Taliban in making sure that, what is continues, and that remember that, when Kabul fell, we still were not in a good place in Afghanistan. So, when we talk about losing the gains, those gains are fragile. And so therefore, really, making the case for that to happen, and this can't be done alone. We've heard lots of governments, the international community, but particularly voices of Afghan women. And I think it's important. We were hearing many of the voices that we are familiar with, who have been on this, at the forefront on this crusade, on this battle, but we also heard from others that we hadn't heard from. And remembering that when we talk about 18 million who are in need of life-saving humanitarian assistance, there's another 18 million who are at risk. So last year's panel discussion with Malala, myself, and Afghan women advocates was amazing. And I think what we had to take from that discussion was two things. We have to stand and try to stop the reverse, but we also have to keep that flame alive of hope. And that this is not being dimmed. And this is what we heard from young people who said that, well, that my future is up in smoke and that's it. No, it's not. We have to have, the muscle that the international community can bring, the know-how and the feet that are on the ground, that are women who know where the shoe is pinching and constantly keep in line with them. Lastly, maybe what I'd say, we do have two tracks, and the two tracks that we have, protecting the gains, engaging with the Taliban, that's one side of it. The other one is that how do we take the silver lining out of this cloud? When COVID happened, and I see COVID as the Taliban coming back to Afghanistan, the silver lining was digital. The silver lining was that we could put our people online working. We could take education back into the virtual space. We could do telemedicine. So I think that we might also have a leapfrogging moment where we could protect women, but still give them an education, still keep them at work. And this is the second track I'd like us not to forget, is that while we're trying to engage and to save the gains and make sure women's rights and girls are at the center of it, there is also the SDGs and there is also the digital divide that we could close rapidly, the silver lining in this very dark cloud.
Thank you, Amina. In fact, you have connected the dots. Everything has to do with everything, and we cannot lose focus from the larger picture as we focus on this very specific issue that pertains to our sisters in Afghanistan. Mary, you were there 20 years ago when all of this started, and the big road that women paved to obtain those gains was launched. And Amina is right to say we must not forget that the gains were many, but they were not absolute gains. So there was still a long way to go. So what is your reading? What is your sense of this backlash now?
Thank you, Susanna. I'm not going to be as coherent and well put together as Amina always is, but yes, I was there as High Commissioner for Human Rights for the first International Human Rights Day in 2002. And I spoke about that in the Security Council on the 7th of September deliberately. And I pointed out that a group of 95 plus wonderful Afghan women, former judges, lawyers, doctors, nurses, community activists, etc., had come together, educationalists, teachers, obviously, and some of them had been involved in teaching girls in the hidden schools, but they devised their own charter, and in launching it on International Women's Day, they praised Allah and then launched their charter. So I said, these are not Western rights, and then I deliberately called on China and Russia in the Security Council to protect those rights in their dealings with the Taliban. And I think we need to say the same to Iran, the same to India, the same to all of the countries, Pakistan in particular, that are, and Pakistan has been a little bit positive so far on the importance of girls and women's rights. So that's the first point I would make. I do think there are so many meetings at the moment on Afghanistan, which is really very welcome, but we need somehow to have a mapping of who's doing what and where we're going. I'm aware that the US-Afghan Women's Council is doing a huge amount, and they've been there since 2002. They have a lot of things. I think the point that Amina made, the importance of listening to Afghan women. I was on a panel with Margaret Wallstrom, who's also one of our vital voices, when I was in New York So it must have been about last Monday. And we listened to 15 Afghan women, each speaking before. Well, actually, what we had done is we had posted our messages to them, and then we heard them live, which was really very impactful. And somehow, you know, I mean, I've been kind of thinking, you know, our Women Leaders Network, this network, Susanna, that you put together of women who've worked in the UN, can we put together a network between Afghan women and global women, so that that network always ensures that Afghan women are at the table, because they absolutely want to be. And there are so many of them now. Many of the, you know, the really bright ones and smart ones and experienced ones are outside the country now. And I mean, from Seema Shamar, who was the Minister for Women's Affairs and became the very good and very brave chair of the International Human Rights, of the Afghan Human Rights Commission. So that's one thought, you know, to encourage a women leaders network of Afghan and more global women who want to help, you know, so that we give them voice at our table all the time. We're having a discussion now, they're not at the table with us, you know, so. Another thing is I was speaking to Henrietta for, we had a call earlier this week, more than a week ago, and she asked me about whether it would be possible to get a group together to support adolescent girls by digital means, a point that, again, you made, Amina. So I brought this to the Connected Women's Forum that I was at in the Hudson Valley, in somewhere called the Omega Institute. Have you been there, Amina? Yeah. So they had a wider Women in Power, and then we had our Connected Women's Leadership Network at the same time. And we sat and talked about getting tech companies to provide the internet access, getting philanthropy and others to provide tablets, etc. I think there are probably other groups doing this as well. And what we need is somehow to connect, you know, rather than be almost complicating things in the delivery on the ground, because different people are doing the same thing but should be coordinating. I don't know how to coordinate, but maybe the UN can provide some kind of a coordinating platform for a huge amount of goodwill that's there. I don't know whether, to me, the adolescent girl staying in education is vital. And the fact that she can't stay in physical education at the moment means she has to stay in digital education. That has to be done quickly. And again, Susanna, if you think this is something that our GWL voices could join with Connected Women Leaders under Pat Mitchell's leadership in particular, I'd be very happy about that. Nobody owns anything of this. It's a question of getting things done. And I think, Amina, we need to sort of try and make those who are doing it from outside in a voluntary way more coherent across the board. So we're not, messing each other up by sort of confusing things on the ground in particular. And the last thing I would say, Amina, and I think it's really important, this is a moment for the UN to stand tall. You know, who left? Everyone except the UN and the Red Cross and NGOs. You're there. And it has been said, but not enough, that the UN actually is the vital last resort and first resort and essential resort for countries. And so, it is a moment to walk tall and talk tall, that the UN is there, will continue to be there, and somehow it makes you then the platform for all the other stuff that people want to do on a voluntary basis. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mary. When people wonder what the UN is for, well, is there when nobody else is there, when everyone left on where nobody wants to go, the UN is there. So I'll come back to you in a second, Amina. Fatia, you have been in Afghanistan. I mentioned your Somali experience, but you have also been there and you have worked on the ground with those women and girls. What is your perspective?
Thank you, Susanna. I think I would join both Mary as well as Amina in two elements that are extremely important. Number one is the achievements that we have secured so far over the past 20 years, but I've worked in the 90s as WFP gender advisor. So I've had the opportunity to engage with the Taliban and to try and secure entry points. And of course in UNAMA and then later on until 2012. So it is important to recognize what we have achieved on the ground in relation to women's rights and girls' rights. And the fact that we see women demonstrating in the streets, which we didn't see in the previous Taliban time, means that we have a strong point that we need to support and secure. What I see is a continued dialogue and engagement first with the Taliban. I think it's not about recognizing them as a government, it's about talking and creating a space where we can secure entry points in order to support women and girls to continue their education, to be in the public sphere, etc., to consolidate what Amina was talking about, the very fragile achievements we've made, and then to open further. So my take on the issue in Afghanistan, while we look at the very negative, is that we have to remain positive. And as Mary was saying, the UN system needs to stand tall. The UN has always been there and now could be really the largest conveners of all the actors in Afghanistan to reach the common ground for negotiation, dialogue, and for continuing the inroads for securing women's rights and girls' rights. Finally, for me, what would be extremely crucial is to link the highest level, which is that dialogue with the Taliban, and what is currently happening, the actions on the ground, in the villages, in the provinces, like in the 90s, to continue the education. And of course, virtual pursuit of that education is going to become very key. So I'm very positive in the sense that we can actually progress towards a better situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Fatia. I mean, I'll go to you, but let me chip in with a couple of things here. I was in the same meeting that Mary referred to, that Margot hosted together with NYU, with all these very powerful Afghan women. One of the things that came out of that meeting was that there is a need to engage with the Taliban, no doubt. All of us agree, and this has nothing to do with government recognition. That's a formality. We are talking about pursuing issues. But one of the main messages that came from that meeting was that it will be important to have women engaging with the Taliban, to have interlocutors from NGOs, from the UN in particular, at the most senior level, when the Taliban are so eager to receive support on so many fronts. Just to have that symbolic reference of women interlocutors is very important. And of course, the conditionality that you referred to will pass through women's hands. So that in itself means a lot. So I just wanted to convey this message. I'm sure you have heard it before, that the importance of having women interlocutors. Yes, Mary.
No, I just wanted to interrupt, Susanna, and build on your point. It was pointed out that the WHO sent a team of, was it 10 men or 12 men, but all men, to Afghanistan, and they were very disappointed in that.
Indeed. Fatia, you want to add something here, and then we go to Amina.
Yes, I fully agree that women should play a central part in those discussions. And I can just very briefly bring an example in 1997 when Angela King led the first high-level gender mission to Afghanistan for negotiations with the Taliban. We were, except for one, only women in those negotiations. And I can say, having been there, it was a very powerful message. So totally agree with you, Susanna. Over to you.
And without delay, over to you, Amina.
Thank you, Susanna. And I think that, look, WHO that goes in with the men are the same WHO that kept women still working when the Taliban said go home. So I think we have to stop to think about how we look at what comes in from the international community and what actually comes forth as women's engagement and leadership in Afghanistan. 18 million of them are not going to leave the country. And we did have many, many interlocutors. And as I said, one of the human rights activists is in part of those protests, organizing them in Kabul. When we took UNHCR in, and Martin Griffiths was speaking to the Taliban, the whole team he took in were women. The two women who lead the mission in Afghanistan are two women. So, I mean, I think, we do have it. I think we need to deploy it in a much more proactive way and perhaps signaling. I think the signal needs to be to the Taliban and not the international community. So that's where we want it to land. I think that right now, and to your point, Susanna, there are many cooks in this kitchen. And so we do need some coherence and coordination. I think Mary also spoke to that. But, the UN that we hail for staying to deliver is not the UN that everybody goes seeking. We seek different pathways and we keep going in different directions. The UN is represented by two mission heads, by a resident coordinator, by a whole team. But reaching out to the UN in Afghanistan, unless you tell me they didn't answer the door when you knocked on it, frankly, I would say to everyone, can you recognize that this is yours? The UN belongs to the people in the world, all member states, and is there staying and delivering. So I think that engagement that we've had, UNDP, UN Women, UNHCR, who work well with women's groups all in the country, there's a lot going on there. And so I think the bigger we make that footprint, that voice, that amplification of what is important will be good. I'm with Fatia that, look, I'm very optimistic about what is possible, but I'm a realist that this is not going to be easy. So we may be taking one step back, but 10 steps forward. I think that we have to recognize that, as I said, Afghanistan lives in a neighborhood. When we have, in the first instances, I have to say everybody's memories are of the 1990s. And so therefore the exodus was on everyone's mind, particularly those women who would have been at risk having worked with us or on the front lines of rights. And so that should be. But to only allow them to go as far as the neighborhood is not exactly helpful either. And I think that is the international community. If you really want to protect women, please think about where you're taking them to, unless, of course, people have forgotten about Malala. That was the neighborhood. So I think we have to be really clear about that. We did speak with, you talked about the possibilities of what exists. And I think we've all spoken to the 2-track, and I think we should continue to be focused on that. But let me bring another issue up, that in the UN, we are driving forth this narrative. There are lives to save, as well as there are livelihoods to protect. If we do not protect the livelihoods, they will end up being more lives that we need to save. The stability of Afghanistan is essential for the woman and the girl and the people of Afghanistan. So the fact that we see the economy, the taps being turned off, and we can understand that we don't want all those, the flow going into the Taliban right now until we can understand what kind of a government is going to be there. But we have to find other creative ways to ensure that what we got in 20 years, at the end of 20 years, was over 60% of the budget was dependent on the international community, paying for salaries, for teachers, for nurses, for keeping the system going. Now, when you turn the tap off, you turn the tap off to basic services for women who are going to give birth, for kids that got to go to school. So all of those, we have to find ways in ensuring that we can get those people up and still running in the communities and in the government, the public service that we talk about. We've done this before in other countries where the UN has been that bridge while we're trying to sort out the environment. And so I think a loud voice from all of us to say that let us not allow the economy to collapse, because that collapse is instability. Third, I'd say that we have, are we looking at the longer term in Afghanistan? Remember that the Taliban have come in to say that they've saved the country. If you have that, you also have a number of people in Afghanistan who support the Taliban. So I think it's very important for us to be very clear about what that means to save the country. And so let's engage with them in understanding that that's the recognition. Saving a country for what? To live within a community where every Afghan man, woman, child has rights, and those rights need to be respected. Let's not forget that many of the rights in Islam are perhaps abused. Doesn't mean that they are wrong, but there are many rights in Islam that surpass the human rights that we have. So let's actually start to talk to them about what it is that they're speaking to. If we say the first word of the Revelations is about the light and education, if we recognize that the Prophet's wife herself, Khadija, was a very, very experienced and successful businesswoman for whom the Prophet worked. So, let's use the narrative that they are familiar with. And in doing so, last but not least, the Taliban rank and file that have put down their weapons have gone home. What are we going to do with them? They've been in the wilderness for 20 years. They also have very little education. How do you do a reintegration of people that have been out of it, unless we want to create another problem for women? So I see lots of opportunity, but I see many, many challenges that we need to be speaking about and pulling these strands together. And they're not always a comfortable discussion, because we do have a narrative that, quite frankly, right now, we need to change. It's not what it was in the 1990s. It is new, it is different, and we have to use different ways and means of getting this right.
Well, and that narrative, and I'll go to you in a second, Fatia, that narrative is also an opportunity, shifting that narrative.
Yes.
And the tools to deploy the narrative, the technology, the digital that you referred to is an opportunity. I think for me, clearly a big challenge that we all face is having that mapping that Mary referred to of who is doing what where, and bringing all of that under a single tent, which in my view, without any question, is the UN tent. We have no alternative. But that is what we have to speak up and have an agreement. This, what we need to do is deliver, and you do not deliver if you are not connected. That's not going to work. Fatia, you wanted to pick up on the narrative. I saw your reaction to what Amina was saying.
Positive reaction, I would say, on three things. Number one, I wanted also to say that to engage with the Taliban, we have to use the Islamic teaching, because it's important to quote, demystify their own distorted view of girls' education according to Islam, and so on and so on. And I do remember negotiations in the 90s with one of the Taliban commanders on that one. So I think this is very important. Engage on the basis they understand well. And, I was surprised they spoke perfect classical Arabic. And so it was easy to use some elements of the Quran to say, hey, this is not possible. It's not correct. So that is extremely important, and is something we need to utilize as a tool. The narrative has changed. The Taliban of the 90s are not the Taliban of today. Today, some of them at that level are much more savvy. They're more educated. They have had the opportunity to engage in the Doha debates and dialogue for peace. So they're much better able at negotiating. And I think it's very important. However, and I agree with Amina, we have a large proportion of them who are now out on the street, as we saw in Libya, then and today, with very sophisticated weapons. We need very quickly as an international community to address that issue. Otherwise, peace will elude all of us. So for me, those are some of the issues that I agree we need to look at with a common voice, on a common platform, with a common goal. Thank you.
And we also need to recognize, I'll go to you, Amina, in a second. We need to recognize that we are here, and Amina referred to this, with a society that is divided. That has to be recognized. And some of this is the fruit of the things we did not, the royal we, the big we didn't do right in these 20 years. Not everything was done in a manner that really got root in the society. Amina?
Just very quickly, Susanna, I mean, Jamila Afghani was part of those negotiations, and what she took, which is so brilliant, was a great knowledge of the Quran. And I'll keep saying this again, you know, what we have in Islam is the Quran and not a pope. And so it's a very important document. It doesn't lie. What it does, you can quote, and there's no one that can say not. They can misinterpret it, but they can't argue with it because it is one word. And that's a powerful way in which our women, Afghani women, actually tackled the negotiations. And those negotiations were for the exit. And I think that where we missed here was that now maybe that table that has finished negotiating for the exit needs to be expanded and become a table that negotiates for the future of Afghanistan. And because you already have people there. It's there in Doha. It's there with a recognized mix of different players. It could be expanded. Let's build on what we have, because I think it's going to be really tough to start to create another mechanism which has this engagement. Right now, we're engaging in fits and starts and entry points to humanitarian, but we will need to come back to a table. What table would that be, and what would it look like? And just a reminder to what Fatia was saying about the difference of the Taliban today. In my panel discussion, I mean, I quite frankly was shocked when people referred to the Taliban leadership today, whose children are in universities in the West. So we do have not just a divided society, but we have a Taliban that is not a command and control, and therefore it's in their interest to find the bridge to bring the rest of their rank and file with the Afghan population. They have a responsibility. The tools we have in the United Nations, they cannot ignore. They are part of if they want to be part of the international community, they're bound by them. So just knowing that the fragility is not just our gains, the fragility is also the transition. And again, just to keep saying, if our interest is in protecting the gains, and particularly the rights of women and girls, which we are all here around the table for, then we also have to be interested in the transition. And that transition is difficult to deal with because it's not exactly what we are all very used to. As they say, in this case, you're going to be dining with the devil with a long spoon for the greater good of all.
It is a messy transition, no question about it. Mary, you wanted to chip in here.
Yeah, I agree with the points about the way of dealing with and engaging with the Taliban, and using the Muslim faith as a way of opening up space to further that dialogue. I want to come back to the point that a number of us have been making about the importance of women from Afghanistan being part of the solutions going forward. And I don't think we've cracked that. I'm very impressed with the work that has been done by the US Afghan Women's Council. I mean, it's a really remarkable thing, but then the US is not going to be there. I mean, that's all very well, and they can provide support. But I think, Amina, there needs to be some complement to the UN in its role, and the UN as a platform for things like collective women leaders doing, where there is a partnership between Afghan and a broader group of women that the UN has brought together. Because that's moving forward. That's where we are.
Mary, there is a UN Women network with Afghan women that is currently working. Maybe what we need to do is to connect the rest of the partnership to that.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Yeah.
Yes, so I think probably because it's implementing on the ground, it's less about the advocacy outside, because we were with the Afghan government working to broaden the scope for women's rights and girls' rights in Afghanistan. I'll link you up with that, because I do know it exists and it's been working on implementation.
Yeah, well, that's particularly good, because that's the missing link. If we can link the outside voices that can come up with ideas, come up with innovations, come up with resources with what's happening on the ground, so much the better. I mean, sounds
absolutely.
Like, yeah.
And also, Susanna, when I discussed with Malala, we talked about the whole connectivity piece, and she said that she belonged to a champions, a girls group in Afghanistan, where they were already doing this. But what we need to do now is to scale it up. When I was in Afghanistan, the minister there was traveling between, I believe it is one of the stands, whether it's Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan and Pakistan, to get the infrastructure up. And so that was a major part of the investments that were being made. Now, how we go about this, what I think is a really big opportunity to scale up the connectivity and close the digital divide, also needs to be handled with care, lest you use it as a finger that you're poking in the eye of the enemy. I don't know what I want to call them, but the Taliban, and then it could backfire. So everything needs to be done with a real sense of the implications, always in mind, on how this could be a backlash on the women and girls that are currently, behind in Afghanistan.
Well, everything has to be done with high sensitivity, Amina, because we are talking about very sensitive issues. I think what we are coming out of this conversation is very important. The connection between the local and the global. The global trying to come up with ideas, suggestions, and resources, but very importantly, to keep the attention, because one of the issues that we all run is that this issue fades away in a few weeks or months, and we need this issue to stay at the forefront in order to retain the leverage to make it happen. So one thing is for us to connect, to include Afghan women continuously, to have the UN at the center. There is no other way to do it. Everyone else left. And let me say this again, when no one is there, the UN is the only one left to do what needs to be done, to pick up the pieces. And we must not forget, so the UN needs to receive the trust, the resources, the support, but also needs to be the vehicle. You mentioned something, Amina, which to me is very important. There is no doubt that the world wants to understand what the Taliban as an eventual government is going to do. So there is conditionality to keep continuing any support, no doubt about it. But in the meantime, what? And we know that there are ways to breach through the United Nations, and that has to happen now, not yesterday, not tomorrow, now, almost yesterday, So is there anything going on at this point, Amina, that one could say it will secure some lifeline that not only saves lives, but also livelihoods?
Well, at the moment, there is a group that is being chaired in the UN that's it looked before then to the day after. Now, of course, we're in the day after, of bringing together the humanitarian, the political, and the development side. So all is treated as an emergency response. And currently, we have UNDP leading those discussions now with the World Bank, because it is with the World Bank that we have this mechanism in Yemen that worked for us and made sure that we protected women and very vulnerable families. So there is that. I think that, we can increase the pressure in terms of the urgency. There are, again, very thin lines between what we need to do yesterday and the concerns that we give recognition to the Taliban. And I think that that's where we're all struggling. If you speak with the bank, they have shareholders, they have governing boards. And I think that it's those governments that we need to be speaking to, the G7, the G20, to bring a greater understanding of the implications of inaction on the economic piece. because really the instability is not just an Afghan issue. It is a neighborhood issue, and it is an international issue. Those borders will just open, and you will suddenly find that the world is coping with an exodus that they had not imagined. So it is worth not charity, but investing in stability, peace, and prosperity for Afghanistan. And if we can make it work in that way, I mean, we tried to make it work in another way in the last 20 years, learn the lessons from 20 years ago. And they will not only profit Afghanistan, they could profit the region and other countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, many places where we have got some serious, pushback against women's and children's rights.
Well, that's exactly why our Global Women Leaders group established itself, Amina. You know, our theme is women's rights and multilateralism, because we believe all of us have been part of the multilateral system, that the gender agenda moved forward after Beijing because of the existence of the UN and the system that put peer pressure to governments to really establish and pass policies that will enable women to have their rights recognized. But that is facing a pushback and what I call an unholy association on one side, as much as there is the strong questioning of the multilateral system. So both things are significant. And we just need to make the case in Afghanistan that whatever is left there to do the job is the United Nations, with a few others, very few others, and that we need to entrust and empower the United Nations to do it, no question about it. Mary, you were trying to say something at this point.
I'm in agreement with the points that have been made, and I'm hoping that Amina, you'll send me that link, or send us that link of women on the ground. And I think we should think about how to create a link which involves many of the 15 that Margaret Wallstrom had brought together. I've been on an Irish panel that had an Afghan woman based in Scotland at the moment. I've been on other panels, and I'm sure many, you're on as many. There are a lot of them around. And Seema Samar, I saw a very good video she did at a meeting that Manaz Afkami had organized. And she's very active at the moment in the United States. I think she's based in Texas or somewhere at the moment. And she's trying to do, but it's to have their voices crucially involved in the decisions as we go forward. That's my concern.
Fatia?
Thank you, Susanna. Maybe 3 points. Number one, I totally agree that there are many, many Afghan women outside of Afghanistan that are still very, very active. One of them was part of our panel last week, and she is very active in a small NGO called Action for Development, and they continue to provide education, health services, as well as support to children with disability to this day. And so we're trying to support them. So I think it's very important to bring them in and to ensure that they are the voice for themselves. We need to support them. Number two, coming back to what Amina, you said, Amina, in relation to the absolute urgency, I would say, that we should not allow the humanitarian situation to deteriorate, not only for Afghans, but for the overall peace and security in the region is crucial. And to me, forgive me for saying to me, I think it is important that we recognize that supporting the continuation of a humanitarian support for economic stability and so on, doesn't necessarily mean a recognition. I give the example of Somaliland, for instance. 20 years ago, Somaliland created itself or dissociated from Somalia. And from my work there, in Somalia as well as Somaliland, it's a very thriving area. I'm not saying, it should have been supported or not. It's thriving, it's peaceful, they're doing very well without the recognition of the international community, but with the support to development and so on. So to me, it is very important that we should make that point, that we owe it to the Afghans, to the Pakistanis around, and so on, that we invest in development and stability, because that is the only way we can secure and sustain peace. Thank you.
Before going back to you, Amina, let me bring, we have somebody from our audience, is one of our members, Ahmad Al-Soswa. She coincides with everything that has been said, but she brings something to our attention, which is also a lesson to be learned. She indicates that Afghanistan was almost fully dependent on external aid for the past 20 years, and we see where they got. So that's another lesson, how we address the needs of a country in a manner that gives a opportunity to really establish itself beyond relying only in external aid. Over to you, Amina.
Thank you, Susanna. 3 points. The other day, the announcement that the Ministry of Women's Affairs had been cancelled. Look, dismantled. Dismantled. I didn't take that. I thought that was sad, but it wasn't a problem. What we should have done, rather than just condemn it, that's when we would have said, okay, so in the existing ministries that you have, can you put a Department of Women in every one of them? This is what we should have said. But not just, okay, we lost the Ministry of Women's Affairs. Quite frankly, in my country, in several of the states, they got rid of the Ministry of Women's Affairs because they couldn't understand how they would give all the money to the Ministry of Women's Affairs when women were an integral part of every sector. So, we said, no, this ought to be the watchdog to make sure everyone's doing what they're doing, the check and balance on what's supposed to happen. So more a policy monitoring piece. And, we should have argued for that and supported our Afghan sisters to do it. It's not finished yet because this government is said to be interim. So we still have an opportunity while they are waxing strong to get in there and to say, okay, in these critical ministries, if not in all, we should have a very strong Department of Women's Affairs, and that requires women in the ministries, which means that we can keep women working. The second, it's really important, and I think, Fatia spoke to this in Somalia. We have to remember that countries are beyond capitals. Afghanistan is beyond Kabul. There are provinces there where we really need to be rooting the change, and not all of them are the same. It's a conservative country. And so therefore, we need to find those islands of stability and the gold standard to try to move everyone to at their pace. Let's remember that many of the journeys we've taken in the West have taken a long time. There were atrocities that are committed in our past histories in the West, and we somehow got to the gold standard. How did we do that? A lot of it was investment, but investment at scale and investment in the right building blocks for a nation. And so again, coming back to nation building, men matter for women. Men matter for women in Afghanistan, and women matter more for the whole country. But let's not leave the men out of this. And this is what I'm talking about in the communities where they are going to go back if we don't take care of how it is we're going to educate them. And in educating them, we could then bring them up to speed with how they should be. That they collaborate, they partner, they live together and benefit from women in a way that they are part of nation building. Right now, you have a mindset Islamically that says I must feed, clothe, and house my wife, and that my wife is the most important thing for building that family in the society. And if the family collapses because she's out at work or she's here or she's there, then the society collapses and everything collapses. This is the uncomfortable narrative we have to deal with, to say to them, well, actually, you can do it all. You don't have to say that the woman will not have a career. In fact, it's better for her, and that she doesn't have an education. It's better for her, better for your family. So if you're talking about the importance of a family, it's not just for you to provide, the woman also provides because she's there, she's caregiving. If she has an education, she'll probably give you more advantage as well as the family. So the narrative itself, let's actually try to see how we don't have one side and the other. Because in the end, these men are living with the women. They're in the societies, they're in the communities, and you're not going to be able to separate them. So if we put women and girls at the mercy of these men, then what we have really is a regression of all the gains that we've had. So they have to be engaged with beyond the Taliban leadership in the localities where we are now going to try to invest. If you say recognition that you as men coming back from war are going to join society, so the education you need, the jobs that you will bring, the idea that now this is a brand new Afghanistan where both you and your women work hand in hand. So we have to find that discourse, and I think that's probably going to be the most difficult because it's not in Kabul. It's in the provinces, and each province is different. Each commander that leads those provinces is different. And then maybe last but not least, Susanna, we got to be here for the long haul. We were there 20 years. Now's not the time to step back. We have to be here for the long haul.
Well, the UN is always there for the long haul. I mean, there is no choice.
Royal you.
Indeed. Fatia.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry to take the floor again. Two things. Once again, I think Amina and I should have met a long time ago because we agree. Number one, on the dismantling of the women's ministry, I have my notes here that say exactly what you say, Amina, is that if that happened, then we should focus on the mainstreaming in other ministries, and maybe it's even better, please don't shoot me for saying that, it's even better because the Taliban would not have one single focus, which is the women's ministry. So that will be very important, and I think we should work on that. The second thing is really the difference between Kabul and the provinces, and I saw it also in Somalia, but from my work before with WFP in Afghanistan, we found, even during the Taliban time, that it was easier to negotiate a space for women and for girls' education in some cases in the rural areas and some of the provinces, some of them very difficult, like Kandahar, which was the source of the Taliban leadership. And so it is the same thing I found when I was in Somalia. It was easier to do that because in general, the whole political focus is on Kabul or Mogadishu. And therefore, if one is able to negotiate those processes along the line you have outlined, Amina, I think we have a way forward, let's put it that way. Thank you.
Listen, we are pretty much getting to the end of this conversation. Let me try and summarize a few things that I think come out of it. Amina, you talk about the gold standard of nation building. You know, I'm not sure that there is such a gold standard. There are objectives, there are end pictures, but all of us, I will say, are still building our nations, you know, and we are seeing how much in the West, democracy is being challenged for different reasons. So we should come with a humble perspective on nation building, a very humble perspective of a continuum. We are here for the long run. We are here to really establish the basis of a society that can live together with respect to all, but particularly, no doubt, respect for women and girls and their rights that have not been fully considered in the past. This notion of women's rights versus family rights is a narrative that we need to really build an alternative, and it's not only for Afghanistan, it's for many other places, so it's a very important thing. But on Afghanistan in particular, I will say I come out of this conversation with some to-dos. One is to make sure that we connect all the networks of people who are working in different fronts, and Mary gave us some examples to make sure that our efforts are absolutely interconnected. Second, that we connect those international voices with the local voices so that clearly there is an alignment and we don't preach in the desert for things that are useless to the ones on the ground. Third, that we put a lot of emphasis on connectivity, digital technology, which will allow for women and girls in particular to keep their education in a transition where they are to stay a little bit more at home than what they were doing so far. And all of this we have to do with the understanding that we have to find ways to talk with the Taliban and to persuade that this is in the best interest of Afghanistan, of the future of Afghanistan. So no easy task, not at all. But I will say, DSG, you count on us, you count on many others. We want to support, we want to help. We are just a little tiny piece in this big, big chain, but we want to make sure that the chain works, and the chain is in the hands of the United Nations. There is no other alternative. So thanks to all of you. Thanks to you, Amina, because you gave us your time in this very, very difficult week of so many things going on. Do let us know why, when, how, and in which way we can help and be supported. And we will be connecting with all these other efforts that are already going on. And to our Afghan sisters, from our heart, we'll continue to be here as we are for all Afghans.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Thanks to the audience. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.